She was there, and then she wasn't. One moment, a woman. The next, nothing but dark water, a silent dinghy, and a husband with a story that keeps changing. No scream, no witness, no body. Just 62 days of silence while her mother sits by a phone that never rings and her daughter holds on to the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, her mom is somewhere out there needing a break from life. But the ocean doesn't lie, and neither does a GPS. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not a movie. It is the story of a real woman who loved the sea, who called it her happy place, who documented her life in beautiful sun-soaked photos for the world to see. And then one night in the Bahamas, she vanished. The search is over. The body has not been found. But the investigation, that is just getting started. Miloso viewer warning. This video contains details of an ongoing investigation involving alleged domestic violence, a suspicious disappearance, and possible homicide. The content may be deeply disturbing for some viewers. Please watch with discretion. If you are new here, welcome to True Crime News Report. Hit that subscribe button right now because this case is moving fast and you do not want to miss a single update. Drop a like, share this with someone following the case, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? It is April 4, 2026. The sun has already gone down over the Abaco Islands in the Bahamas. The water is dark, the winds have picked up, and somewhere out on the Sea of Abaco, a 55-year-old woman from Michigan is gone. No distress call, no rescue, no witness. Just a man paddling a small dinghy toward shore alone, and a story that would not hold up for long. That woman is Lynette Hooker. To the people who loved her, she was a mother, a daughter, and someone who had spent the better part of a decade building a life on the open water. To the tens of thousands who followed her online, she was one half of a sailing couple who documented their adventures on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under the handle The Sailing Hookers. Her posts were filled with blue water, sunshine, Caribbean sunsets, and captions like living our best life. She was not a passive passenger on that boat. Darlene Hamlet, her mother, told reporters that the family grew up on water and that Lynette's life had always been near lakes, on boats, sailing, and swimming. Lynette knew the sea. She was comfortable on it. That fact alone made the story her husband was about to tell investigators very difficult to accept. Brian Hooker is 58 years old, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and the man Lynette had been with for approximately 25 years. By the time of Lynette's disappearance, the two of them had been living full-time aboard their sailboat, a vessel they named the Soulmate. They purchased the Soulmate in Rockport, Texas in 2023, and their first major documented voyage was a Gulf crossing out of the port town of Kemah, Texas, which Lynette filmed and posted with a wide smile and the words, "We are finally leaving." From that point forward, the Soulmate became their home, their adventure, and the backdrop for nearly every piece of content they shared with the world. They sailed the Gulf of Mexico, crossed into the Caribbean, and made repeated trips to the Bahamas. On the outside, it looked like exactly what they called it, a love story at sea. On the evening of April 4, Brian Hooker told Bahamian authorities that he and Lynette had departed Hopetown on the Abaco Islands in their 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy at approximately 7:30 in the evening. Their destination was the Soulmate, which was anchored nearby near Elbow Cay. According to Brian, conditions on the water deteriorated quickly. He told police that unpredictable seas and high winds caused Lynette to fall overboard. He said she was wearing the engine's safety lanyard, a cord designed to cut engine power if the operator goes overboard, which meant when she fell, the engine shut off entirely. He claimed strong currents carried her away and that he lost sight of her. Brian told authorities he then paddled the dinghy to shore by hand, a journey that took him several hours. Arriving at Marsh Harbor Boatyard at approximately 4 in the morning on April 5. He relayed what had happened to someone at the boatyard, and that person contacted the Royal Bahamas Police Force. The Royal Bahamas Police Force became the first law enforcement body on this case. They opened a search for Lynette and took Brian's statement. 3 days later, a flotation device Brian said he had thrown to Lynette during the incident was recovered along a shoreline. Lynette herself had not been found. Carly Aylesworth is Lynette's daughter and Brian's stepdaughter. She had doubts about Brian's account from the moment she heard it. She told CBS News that her mother was an experienced swimmer and sailor, and she publicly questioned how Lynette could have been holding the boat keys if Brian was typically the one driving the dinghy. Carly told reporters plainly that she did not believe her mother would just fall from a boat. She had been watching her mother's relationship with Brian for years, and what she knew about that relationship made Brian's version of that night very hard to believe. Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother, was in Michigan when her daughter was reported missing. She was not getting answers from anyone quickly enough. She had not heard from Brian in any meaningful way. She was waiting, the way only a mother can wait, for a phone call that had not come. Back in the Bahamas, the official story was already under pressure. The Royal Bahamas Police Force had a missing woman, a husband with a difficult-to-verify account, and a sea that was giving nothing back. Before the sun had fully risen on April 5, questions were already forming that Brian Hooker's version of events was not going to be able to answer. This case is still active, and every development is being covered here as it happens. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what comes next in this investigation changes everything. The night of April 4th, 2026 did not happen in a vacuum. What took place on the Sea of Abaco that evening was the latest entry in a documented history that stretched back more than 2 decades. Police reports, court records, family accounts, a paper trail that investigators would not have to work hard to find because much of it was already sitting in Kentwood, Michigan, filed and stamped and waiting. In November 2005, the Kentwood Police Department opened a child abuse investigation documented under complaint number 19918-05. Brian Hooker's daughter from a previous relationship, Elizabeth Hoseth, was visiting him and Lynette at their home when an argument broke out over a science book. Brian reportedly objected to the book's content on religious grounds. According to child witnesses interviewed by Detective Michella Clark, Brian chased his daughter upstairs, pinned her against a door, and placed both hands around her neck. One witness told police the child was lifted partly off the ground during the incident. Another witness reported that Brian repeated the words, say, "Yes, sir, young lady," before releasing her. Brian sent an email to his ex-wife afterward acknowledging the children, "And I had a rough time tonight." He was arrested and charged with 4th-degree child abuse in December 2005. At trial, Lynette testified that Brian had not choked their daughter. A Kent County jury acquitted him in February 2006. That acquittal is the legal outcome, and it stands. But the documented witness accounts, the police photographs showing red marks on the child's neck, and the referral to the Michigan Family Independence Agency identifying Brian as the alleged perpetrator are all part of the public record. 10 years later, the Kentwood Police Department was called to the Hooker residence again. On February 1, 2015, officers responded to a report of an intoxicated female locked in an upstairs bedroom. That incident was documented under Kentwood Police Department Incident number 15, 1952. Both Brian and Lynette were intoxicated. Brian told officers that Lynette had struck him in the face multiple times. Officers documented that he had a bloody and swollen nose. When officers brought Lynette downstairs, She told them that Brian had hit her in the forehead, choked her, and struck her once. Officers noted that Lynette had no visible injuries. A witness in the home told police she had heard a commotion upstairs and saw Brian go up and return with a bloody nose. Lynette was arrested that night on charges of assault and battery. The warrant was later reviewed and denied by a prosecutor who found insufficient evidence as to who started the assault. The case was dismissed. Once again, the legal outcome is clear, but the documented accounts of that night from both parties, from the witness and from the officers on scene, established a pattern that Lynette's own family said continued for years after. Jordan Plint lives on the same street as Darlene Hamlet in Onstead, Michigan. She is a neighbor who knew the Hookers peripherally, not as close friends, but as familiar faces who would come and go from Darlene's house across the street. When Lynette would come to stay at her mother's home during periods of separation from Brian, Darlene would let Jordan know someone was staying at the house, so Jordan would not be alarmed by the activity. Over time, Jordan built an understanding of the relationship through those conversations with Darlene. What Darlene told her was consistent and troubling. The relationship was rocky and volatile. Lynette left Brian multiple times over the course of their approximately 25-year marriage, as recently as a year and a half before her disappearance, according to Darlene. Each time, Brian would eventually talk Lynette back. Darlene told investigators that Brian had abused her daughter physically and emotionally across the length of their marriage. That cycle of leaving and returning, documented not just by Darlene but by Carly Aylesworth as well, is precisely the pattern that domestic violence experts describe as one of the most consistent features of high-risk relationships. Carly Aylesworth confirmed to both CNN and NBC News that Brian had made a specific verbal threat at some point during the marriage. He had threatened to throw Lynette overboard. That threat, spoken out loud and now confirmed by Lynette's own daughter to two major national news networks, sits at the center of what investigators were assembling as they looked beyond the night of April 4 and into the full history of this relationship. Between sailing trips, Brian and Lynette would return to Michigan and stay at Darlene's house in Onstead for extended periods, sometimes for months at a time. It was during those stays that the people on that street, Darlene, Jordan, and the neighbors around them, observed the relationship up close. What they saw and what they were prepared to tell federal investigators about would become part of the foundation being built around this case. Investigators looking at the disappearance of Lynette Hooker were not simply trying to explain one night on the water. They were building a portrait of a decade-long relationship with a documented history of conflict, a pattern of control and return, and a specific spoken threat that now carried a very different weight. And that paper trail was about to become the foundation of a federal investigation. For 5 days, Brian Hooker was in the custody of the Royal Bahamas Police Force, questioned as a suspect in his wife's disappearance. His attorney, Terrell Butler, said publicly that her client was cooperating and had so far been treated as a witness. On April 13, Bahamian authorities released him without filing any charges. Butler declined to discuss the details of the ongoing investigation. The next day brought one of the stranger turns in the early case. In an interview with ABC News, Brian said he intended to stay in the Bahamas until his visa expired, insisting his only focus was finding Lynette. Within hours of that interview airing, he boarded a flight back to the United States. His attorney later said the decision was driven by his mother's terminal illness and that he needed to be with her. For Carly Aylesworth, Lynette's daughter, the abrupt departure deepened doubts she had been voicing publicly almost from the start. She told ABC News she had questioned Brian's account of that night. from the very beginning, and his decision to leave the island so soon after vowing to stay did nothing to ease that suspicion. In Onstead, Michigan, Darlene Hamlet's contact with her son-in-law also thinned out around this period. According to people close to the family, after the earliest days of the search, meaningful communication from Brian largely stopped, and Darlene has said she hasn't spoken to him since. Behind the scenes, the investigation was shifting from a missing person search to something more formal. A U.S. official told CBS News that the Coast Guard Investigative Service had opened a federal criminal investigation examining the case as the possible murder of a U.S. national on foreign waters, a designation that gave federal agents jurisdiction even though Lynette vanished in Bahamian territory. One of the most consequential moves came on the water. The Soulmate, the sailboat Brian and Lynette had called home for years, was intercepted by the U.S. Coast Guard roughly 40 nautical miles off the Florida coast as it made its way back to the mainland. The vessel was brought into the Coast Guard station at Fort Pierce, where it remained moored, while agents began a methodical forensic sweep. Every system, every device, every piece of onboard electronics. Among the equipment investigators were especially interested in was an infrared camera system with its own cloud storage, a potential source of footage or data from the night Lynette disappeared. At the same time, evidence began moving north to the FBI's laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. Dental records were obtained, and DNA samples were collected from Carly Aylesworth and other family members. Standard steps in any case where investigators may eventually need to identify remains. But the detail that reshaped the entire investigation came from something far smaller than a 38-foot sailboat. The GPS history stored on one of Brian's own electronic devices. According to officials who spoke to both CBS News and ABC News, the data showed the device traveling out onto the water on the night of April 4, stopping at a specific point in the Sea of Abaco, and then returning a track that did not match the route Brian had described to investigators. Officials said his account had effectively sent early search teams toward the wrong stretch of water entirely. For the first time, investigators had something more than one man's narrative to work from. They had a location drawn from his own phone that sat in direct tension with the story he had told police, to reporters, and to his wife's family. This is where the account Brian Hooker gave investigators began to come apart. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime and has consistently denied any wrongdoing in connection with his wife's disappearance. The Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norvell, homeported in Miami, made its way back into the Sea of Abaco at the start of June, carrying with it the people who would spend the next several days trying to answer the one question that had defined this case since April. Where is Lynette Hooker? This was not the same operation that had combed these waters in the days after she vanished. This time, the Coast Guard Investigative Service brought its own federal special agents into the mix, working alongside Coast Guard divers, remotely operated underwater vehicles, sonar equipment, and unmanned aerial drones. On the shoreline near Hopetown, not far from the Abaco Inn, a cadaver dog named Maggie, on loan from the Broward County Sheriff's Office in Florida, worked the coastline with her handler. The areas they searched were not the areas Brian had described to investigators back in April. The Bahamian government had granted U.S. authorities permission to examine a handful of newly identified locations across several miles of water in the Sea of Abaco, areas drawn not from Brian's account of that night, but from the GPS data pulled from his own device. For 4 days, the team worked through these zones systematically, covering open water and shoreline alike. When it was over, the Coast Guard issued a brief statement. The mission had concluded. No remains had been recovered. Lynette Hooker had not been found, not in the water, not on the shore, not anywhere the new data had pointed them. But the statement carried one more piece of information, almost as an afterthought, that mattered more than anything else in it. During the mission, the Coast Guard Investigative Service had taken custody of the dinghy, the 8-foot boat at the center of Brian's account, transferring it from Bahamian authorities to the United States for further forensic examination. It is now in federal hands, and according to CGIS, the investigation continues. For the people back in Onstead, Michigan, that phrase, "the investigation continues," has meant something very specific. It has meant federal agents showing up in their community, asking questions about a marriage that many of them had quietly worried about for years. One of those people is Jordan Plentz, a neighbor of Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother. Plentz has said publicly that she does not believe Lynette drowned that night. Speaking to News Nation, she said she thinks something happened before the dinghy ever went into the water. She has also said the FBI has been in contact with her directly as part of the investigation. Plentz has talked about a security camera mounted at the front of her house, one that captures a view of much of the street, including the comings and goings at Darlene's home, where Brian and Lynette would stay for extended periods between sailing trips. She has indicated she's willing to provide whatever footage exists to investigators if it would help. What that footage might show, if anything, is something only investigators know at this point. But between the dinghy, now sitting in a federal evidence room, and whatever has or has not been captured on a neighbor's camera in Lenawee County, two very different kinds of evidence, one physical, one digital, now sit at the center of where this investigation goes next. The search in the Bahamas is over. The investigation, by the Coast Guard's own description, is not. Since leaving the Bahamas, Brian Hooker has said almost nothing. There has been no press conference, no tearful appeal for tips, no public statement responding to the Coast Guard's renewed search or its conclusion. While federal agents, divers, and a cadaver dog spent 4 days combing the Sea of Abaco for his wife. The man who once told ABC News his sole focus was finding her was nowhere to be heard from. That silence has not gone unnoticed in Onstead, Michigan. Jordan Plentz, a neighbor who watched the Hookers come and go from Darlene Hamlet's house for years, has described the marriage in blunt terms, telling reporters that the couple fought for a long time and that the conflict between them was serious. Carly Aylesworth, Lynette's daughter, has gone further, telling Fox News there is a history of him choking her mother and threatening to throw her overboard, and saying that what's happening now makes her believe there's more to this story than what's been told publicly. Then came a new report, one that shifted the conversation entirely. According to Fox News Digital, a source described as a close friend of Brian's said he may have left the United States altogether, possibly crossing into Mexico from San Diego by land or even by water. A second source, speaking anonymously, said Brian had made similar crossings before, traveling from San Diego into Tijuana for day trips, at times when border agents on that stretch didn't always ask for a passport or even identification. It's worth saying plainly, none of this has been confirmed by federal investigators. There has been no official statement placing Brian outside the country, no announcement of a warrant, no charge of any kind. Brian Hooker has not been accused of murder or any other crime. His legal team has continued to maintain that he is innocent and has denied any wrongdoing in connection with Lynette's disappearance. But the speculation alone was enough to draw a reaction from people who have spent careers on the other side of cases like this. Nicole Parker, a former FBI special agent and Fox News contributor, said there is probably a lot more evidence than what the media or the general public is even aware of. Julie Rendelman, a former federal prosecutor, was asked directly what it would mean if Brian had, in fact, slipped across the border. Her answer was pointed. "You can't fail more," she said, "than letting someone who's the subject of a potential murder investigation leave the Bahamas, return to the United States, and then disappear altogether. They would have a lot of answering to do," she added. "I'm going to guess they know where he is, but they're not acting on it until they're more comfortable with their case." That last line may be the truest thing said about this case in weeks. If federal investigators are waiting, it isn't because they've lost interest. If anything, this is where the pressure on Brian Hooker really begins. Step back from the individual headlines for a moment and look at what investigators are actually holding, all at once, for the first time laid out together. There is GPS and AIS navigation data pulled from Brian's own devices and from the Soulmates onboard systems, data that, according to officials who spoke to CBS News and NBC News, does not match the account he gave police about where he was the night Lynette disappeared. There is the Soulmate itself, seized at sea and brought into Coast Guard custody for a full forensic sweep of its systems and electronics. There is the dinghy, the 8-foot boat at the center of Brian's story, now in federal hands after a custody transfer from Bahamian authorities. There is evidence moving through the FBI's laboratory at Quantico, alongside DNA samples that Carly Aylesworth has confirmed she provided to the Coast Guard. There is a 2015 Kentwood police report documenting a night when both Brian and Lynette accused each other of assault, a report that ended without charges, but that sits in the public record regardless. There is Carly's account, repeated to multiple outlets, of a history that included her stepfather choking her mother and threatening to throw her overboard. And there is Jordan Plentz, a neighbor in Onstead, working to recover security footage from a camera that watched the street where Brian and Lynette stayed during their visits home. None of this, on its own, proves anything. But taken together, it's the kind of picture that prosecutors who handle cases like this say can matter even when the most obvious piece of evidence, a body, is missing. That question, whether someone can be charged with murder when there's no body to point to, has come up directly in this case. Tad DiBiase, a prosecutor who has built much of his career on so-called no-body cases, was asked about exactly that on the podcast Brian Entine Investigates. Based on public reporting alone, DiBiase laid out what he saw as the likely foundation of probable cause here. By Brian's own account, the two of them were heading back to a boat far larger than the 8-foot dinghy they were riding when Lynette went over the side. But both his personal GPS and the boat's AIS navigation system, DiBiase said, don't match that story. A discrepancy of that kind between a person's own account and their own devices is precisely the sort of thing that has supported homicide prosecutions in the past, even without remains ever being recovered. There's also a jurisdictional piece that matters here. Because Lynette is a U.S. citizen, federal law gives American investigators authority to pursue a case involving her possible murder, even though it happened in Bahamian waters, separate from whatever the Bahamas itself might require under its own laws. That's part of why CGIS, a Coast Guard agency, has been able to take custody of evidence and lead an investigation into something that happened thousands of miles from its home port. Whether any of this points to something planned rather than something that happened in the moment is a question that's being asked, but not one anyone has answered. It's the kind of question that tends to follow cases where the official story and the data don't line up. And for now, that's where it sits, a question, not a conclusion. For Carly Aylesworth, the last 2 months have meant giving her DNA, setting up a GoFundMe to help her family travel back to the Bahamas, and waiting. Her page still reads simply, "Memorial for my mom." In early May, she wrote that the money would help her family go back to the Bahamas to get answers. She has said she's still hopeful, even as she said the longer this goes on, the more doubt she has. Jordan Plentz, for her part, has said she doesn't think anything in this case becomes final until Lynette is found. But she said she feels the direction things are heading, even if she can't say when. And she said she's prepared to hand over whatever her camera recorded, whatever she witnessed on that street, to whoever needs it. For anyone with information connected to April 4, the soulmate, or anything else tied to this case, the Coast Guard Investigative Service has a Tips app available on iOS and Android where information can be submitted anonymously. Lynette Hooker has been missing since April 4, 2026. The search in the Bahamas has ended. The investigation has not. The dinghy is in federal custody. The soulmate remains under examination. Evidence continues to move through Quantico. And wherever Brian Hooker is, the people watching this case on both sides of the law are still watching for what happens next.